This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
This is the Books Podcast. We're talking to Philip Norman, who has written the definitive biography of Paul McCartney. You've already done John. You're famous for Shout, the first important biography of the Beatles. Now, Paul, you quote Rolling Stone magazine as saying that Paul, of all the rock stars in history, has done the least to fuck up his good luck. But you still found him interesting enough to write about.
Yes, for years I sort of accepted the view of Paul that Paul puts out, which is someone who's blessed with enormous talent, enormous charm, enormous good looks, and therefore one thinks is rather
all of that is true.
Yes, but you think that makes somebody very self-satisfied, but actually creative genius, which is what he has, is never self-satisfied. I found him much more complex, quite insecure, as insecure in his own way as John Lennon was. John Lennon's insecurity came from a sort of dislocated childhood. Paul had a happy childhood, but still this tremendously strong sort of remorseless creative urge that grips him. He's never really happy with anything he does, in the same way that John wasn't.
Do you think that's true, that he's not happy, or is he just looking for new frontiers? Because he keeps restlessly finding a new form to write in, doesn't he?
It's just the need to be in front of an audience, the need to be on stage almost every night of his life as he enters his mid-70s, and to receive that love and that approval. As if it's not enough. You would think that this man has had more adulation than any human being could possibly absorb. But as I say in my book, this kind of adulation is a bit like Chinese food. It just goes straight through people like this and leaves them wanting more in another half an hour.
Your opening chapter is basically an account of your relations with the Beatles and the times you've met them and things. So, it's going to provoke a good deal of envy. You have, of course, met the Beatles. You've spoken to Paul and you've met him recently. But this is not an authorised biography.
It's sort of authorised by the back door. He gave me what he called tacit approval. There was no way that his time of life he was going to sit down and plough through the Beatles story all over again, step by step. And in fact, I don't write the Beatles story all over, step by step. Paul is centre stage, and the story is happening, a lot of it off stage. But his so-called tacit approval allowed me to talk to family members and very, very close associates of his over the years, who normally, because of the huge loyalty that he commands, would not talk to a writer, and family members in particular.
It's a biggish book, but you don't try and do every day of his life, do you? It's not a day in the life.
It's not true. No, I try to sort of live every day of John's life. This is different because the Beatles' audience is so enormous and so knowledgeable that one can mention something like the Ed Sullivan Show or the Cavern Club in Liverpool, and people know what you mean. So I don't have to simply go in for exposition for all of these sort of locations and all these references.
I should put my cards on the table. I am a Beatles anorak and a huge Paul admirer. I think he is a national treasure. In fact, I'm going to suggest that he's the greatest pop star of all time. What do you think? Do you think that's fair?
Well, he's so many things. I mean, he was part of the Beatles, who are simply unsurpassed, just because of the era that they were in and the legacy that they have created. But then he is also the most successful songwriter of all songwriters. So you can say he's perhaps the most famous person on the planet.
Let's talk about that period just after the Beatles broke up, because you're very good on that. That's partly where you hone in on the insecurities and the character of the man. He did have some pretty bad times. He was not a happy bunny.
Again, one thought at the time, Paul McCartney is just confident that he's going to go on and be solo Paul McCartney, and he goes off and makes a solo album, and it's all sort of smooth and a smooth transition to another band called Wings. Wasn't that way at all. Really, Paul and Linda, his wife, and his brother-in-law, John Eastman, Linda's brother, and his lawyer by that time, were alone against the world very much disapproving of him, but also the other three Beatles who had sidelined him very, very nastily, actually. And the appointment of Alan Klein, brought in by John, they were really sort of the little unit fighting on their own. And Paul went off to his farm in Scotland and had a sort of breakdown. Now, John went in for very, very public therapy. Paul also needed therapy, but he gave it to himself, really, or rather the Scottish Highlands gave it to him. But he was in a very bad way. He was drinking very heavily. He was having a sort of breakdown. He was thinking that he was on the scrap heap, but at the age of 27, which is extraordinary, because the Beatles had been so big. He'd been so famous, and now that was all over. And he was without these other three to whom he had been so close. I mean, the closeness of the Beatles was extraordinary. Physical closeness, when they were still not very well known, driving around Britain in a van, and it was very cold in the van. They would lie in a pile in the back of the van. I mean, lie on top of each other so that the person underneath got warm. And then they'd switch over, and the one from the bottom would go to the top of the pile. They shared body warmth. That was how close they were. And you can hear the closeness, of course, in their harmonies too. That was gone. So he felt very, very insecure, very, very lost. And it took a long time for Wings to catch on. People forget this. John, had really, a lot of notice with his solo albums right away. George Harrison had his global mega album, All Things Must Pass. Even Ringo was doing rather well. Paul had to wait really until Band on the Run to get both the...
And Band on the Run was 1973.
73.
It was nearly 3 years after the Beatles had broken up.
And in that time he was selling records, but he was getting very horrible comments in the media and in the press, particularly as he chose to start right at the bottom. He put his new band into a van. They drove around Britain, calling at universities to see if the Students' Union would like them to play.
He would have done that with the Beatles if they'd let him.
Yes.
If the Beatles had been prepared to get in a van, Paul would have driven them off to play anywhere.
Well, that is a measure of the musician that he is, and he still is, of course, that he will play anywhere for anybody. He'll play for a pet chimpanzee, which he's done, just an audience of one chimpanzee. So, yes, that is the measure of the performer, and that is the measure of the person who didn't want to give up the Beatles, because his fulfillment was communing with an audience. As
so often in his life, he was right about Alan Klein, the manager that John brought in. He was proved triumphantly right that Klein was a crook and was going to rape the prophets. So this period when he was at odds with the rest of the Beatles was particularly difficult because he was right, I suppose.
Well, Klein did maintain to the end of his life that he had made the Beatles more money than they had ever made before, and he did sign them to a massive deal when it was obvious that they were going to break up with American Columbia. But it was worse than that. It was the terrible embarrassment of having already brought in his wife Linda's father, Lee Eastman, and the Beatles having signed Lee Eastman as general counsel to the Beatles, and then John going off and finding Alan Klein and being kind of romanced by Alan Klein in a way. And that was all dreadful because for a time Lee Eastman and Klein, or rather John Eastman, by then Paul's brother-in-law, and Alan Klein, were simultaneously running the Beatles. That was a hideously embarrassing situation. Again, you don't think of Paul McCartney suffering awful embarrassment, but he did.
And you make a reference to him being the brother-in-law. By that time, of course, he's married Linda, and again, he's right. He's turned out to be right about that. It's the great marriage in pop music of all time. They clearly loved each other. They stuck to each other, and it was a happy union.
It was a tremendously successful marriage. Linda received horrible comments, almost as bad, sometimes worse than Yoko received because for having cut out John from the Beatles. It was sort of level pegging for a lot of time, which of those two were the more hated, was the more hated. But what nobody again could imagine was this man, this wonderfully good-looking Paul McCartney. Every woman in the world wanted to sleep with him. That he
quite a lot of them did.
And quite a lot of them did, sometimes several at once. But still, what he really wanted was a secure home. And nobody could have known that Linda at that time would be the one to provide it. That was what she wanted. She had her own issues about childhood. And so what the sort of salvation of both of them turned out to be was having a home and a large family.
And then, of course, she died rather unhappily and tragically of breast cancer, which obviously knocked Paul back. And he must have thought that he knew everything there was to know about romance, because his next marriage was pretty much a disaster. And everybody warned him against it as well, didn't they? How could he have got that so wrong? He'd been so right about so many things, and he was just so wrong about Heather.
Well, if you're very right about many things, like releasing Mull of Kintyre at the height of punk rock,
which then goes on to sell 2.25 million copies in Britain,
exactly. Yes, and being very right about Alan Klein, and of course it's very hard to tell someone like that they are wrong. He was in a vulnerable state after such a long marriage, after such a terrible illness that Linda had suffered. But there was something in his makeup, something in his genes that was caring and nurturing. This is because his mother had been a nurse and a midwife, and he had seen his mother's tremendously sweet, sort of giving, nurturing nature. That was in him. And, of course, for a lot of Linda's illness, he was effectively her carer as well. And, in fact, he expressed it very succinctly when his friend Joe Flannery in Liverpool said, how could you have made such a mistake? He said it was because of Heather Mills had lost part of her leg. And he said, I looked at her leg and went, He felt protective to her.
And yet, everybody seemed to know. It was very quick that people took against her. And of course, Paul was a national treasure. When she seemed to think that she was more important than Paul McCartney.
Well, to begin with, in fact, people thought she looked nice, and they were glad, that he'd found someone. So it wasn't like it wasn't the same as in the case of Linda, when everybody was against her and slowly warmed to her. In Heather's case, it went the other way.
But much, much more quickly.
It went quickly, yes, the other way, and there were lots of questions asked about her background and her attitude to facts, shall we say?
Yes. She claims to have turned down a peerage from Sir Tony Blair,
and to have been in the running for a Nobel Peace Prize, that sort of thing.
And the judge at the divorce did say that she wasn't to be trusted, that she wasn't a reliable witness.
What is so extraordinary about Heather was and is that she is very, very impressive. She did fight her way out of a terrible childhood. She became a successful model. Then she suffered an appalling accident. She recovered. She fought her way back from that to go back to modelling, and her campaigning against landmines and all, her various causes were extremely impressive. And she married Paul McCartney. Now, why would anyone who has those achievements want to embroider the facts? You don't need to, but it appears that she did.
You talk about his caring side, Paul McCartney's caring side, and he has a reputation for parsimony, and yet you make very clear in the book he's a very generous man. He's given a lot of money, time, considerations to family, friends, but people he liked. Why has he got this reputation for being mean?
I'm not quite sure why. I think that in his for a long time there wasn't a very strong public spirited element visible. But what he went on to do was quite extraordinary. I mean, creating that Performing Arts Academy in Liverpool, which had had a terrible time in the 1980s, and really awful things that happened in Liverpool.
And was a risk if that hadn't worked out.
Yes,
his name was plastered all over.
Exactly, race, riots and dereliction of the city and all the rest of it. And that was the beginning of the road back to self-respect for Liverpool, which it has now. It's a huge success. There was enormous investment, not only of money, but of McCartney's time in that project. And very, very generous to people he knows who are in trouble medically. Horst Fascher, the bouncer, the old bouncer from the Hamburg days, Barry Miles, who was his biographer. But I don't really know where it comes. There are pop stars who are very, very mean, but he's not.
What he is as well is fantastically rich. He's extremely wealthy. I had no idea until I read your book how much property he has. He seems to acquire property all the time, almost casually.
Well, in the two places where he settled in the UK, firstly in the Highlands of Scotland and then in Sussex, he had to sort of create a gigantic exclusion zone to stop, marauding fans. So he had to buy up lots of other farms in Scotland, and then he bought up other properties in Sussex. But yes, he seems to have more houses than one can possibly live in the States as well. To be overhoused, which has its own problems, I'm sure.
I'm sure it does. You seem to regard the drugs bust in Japan in 1979 as kind of almost a pivotal event in Paul's life. You trail it several times beforehand and you deal with it in detail. What is the significance of that drugs bust when he was... Well, let you tell me.
Well, he was... having been banned from Japan for his other drugs offences, and then finally let in the end of 79, the end of 80 actually, and all the band he took with him, being warned, don't go through your luggage, even the seams of your pockets don't have any drugs, and then he's caught with a big lump of hash at the airport, and is put into the story is he was held in a police station. He wasn't. He was put into the most horrific old-fashioned prison in Tokyo, along with killers and convicted murderers. The great significance of that, or the revealing side of that, is that he kind of enjoyed it. It was a relief. He could stop being Paul McCartney for a few days. He was prisoner number 22.
I think he was in for 10 days or something.
Well, yes, not always, not the whole 10 days in that prison, but then there was some sort of technical reason why he went there for the last few days. And it was kind of relief not to be Paul McCartney, and also to sort of make the best of it, which is what he's always managed to do. Optimism, sort of buoyant sort of spirits. And
he likes a bit of adversity, doesn't he?
Yes.
I mean, you detail his approach to the farm in Scotland, which was that he got up on the roof and nailed those tiles on when the roof leaked.
The other surprising thing about him, in fact, is that he can do almost anything on the sort of practical side as well as on the creative side. I mean, he can do everything in music, but he can also lay a flight of concrete steps,
and does.
Yeah, and does.
There are a lot of people who are very capable who, when they get to that level, they get a man in. But Paul likes doing that stuff.
He does, and I can't really think of anything that he can't do to some degree or other. And in that case, that particular, he was sort of felt it was kind of redemption, and he even thought perhaps that he might have been subconsciously asking to be busted in the way that he was.
Well, in the same way that he made Band on the Run famously in Nigeria, in a studio that was not really there. He had to bring equipment in. He had to get them to build baffles and for the drums and things, so that he could record in Nigeria. And he could have recorded in EMI Studio Number 2 as easily as anybody else. But no, he goes to somewhere that presents him with a challenge.
Well, he didn't realise quite what a challenge it was, because he imagined Nigeria as just being sort of lovely, women in colourful headdresses and, joy and laughter. And of course it was a very difficult country under a difficult regime. But once he was there, and of course most of his band defected just before he went out
the
there.
drummer and the guitarist just didn't turn up to the airport and said, no, we're not coming.
That's
so
right.
He goes and does it anyway.
Well, he just said, I'm not going to be beaten, I'm going to do this. It's like the famous sort of Scottish tour for the Beatles. He just made the most of that. He sort of wrote cheerful postcards to his dad saying, I may be signing some autographs tonight. He does have this ability to accentuate the positive.
But is he hard to work for? Quite a lot of people have quit. I know why he gets a reputation for meanness. That on the very first Wings tour, he's actually paying a small stipend to each of the musicians and keeping all the money for himself.
But then, they weren't making any money anyway on those two. He wasn't making any money anyway. And he actually, in the period when he was in Scotland and going through these terrible sort of inner turmoil, was running out of money. They were living on Linda's money. And he did not have an awful lot of money in those very early 70s. But it's true that it was very, very difficult to be in a band with Paul McCartney and Linda. He wanted Linda with him. He wanted, because so that they could go on tours, he didn't have to be separated from her and later on from the children. And so he put her on keyboards, which she couldn't play. But after a while, I mean, the kind of thing she had to play on keyboards wasn't that difficult, and she managed to master
the small solos. I saw the Wings tour in 1979, and at the beginning of Old Siam, Sir, where there's a piano figure that on the record, it just wasn't there. She wasn't up to playing that then, and you did think a little, you cringed a little in embarrassment for her that she wasn't up to playing.
You did, but that was his choice, and for all of that, Wings became vastly successful on the back of the glam rock craze initially, and then as stadium rock increased in scope and size, and in terms of just sort of ticket receipts, they were equaling or surpassing the Beatles in the next decade. Paul's
been given practically every honour you could imagine. He could not be more successful. They gave him the MBE, of course. He's been knighted. Shouldn't he be ennobled? Shouldn't he be Lord McCartney by now? Are there any obstacles to it?
I can't see that there would be, and I'm sure he will be. And when you think of some of the
they gave it to Lloyd Webber.
Scruffy types who have crept into the House of Lords, I mean, he certainly has more cause.
I would think so too. Philip, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Paul McCartney, the definitive biography by Philip Norman. It's Weidenfeld and Nicholson. It's out now, and I think it's £25.
Yes.
A bargain.
Thank you.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.